Can you guys hear me okay? Oh, that's exciting. How I feel like I can ask you, how are you doing? But I also feel like there should be a caveat now for all of us. Like, how are you doing in spite of the garbage fire that is the world? Or how are you doing in spite of everything, right? I'm going to do a little call and response here. How many of you, by show of hands, got at least one? This is going to go a few times, so just bear with me. How many of you got at least one house plant during this quarantine? Raise your hands. Cool, 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 cool. Keep them up, keep them up. Now, the next question is, how many of you have at least one house plant that's doing better than you? Keep it up, keep it up. Cool, cool. Now, one more. How many of you, during the time that you've had this plant, or all of these plants like me, have you gone through at least one really traumatic thing, right? And do we seem like we're crumbling, but we're also thriving? You can put your hands down now. Or maybe kind of both, right? COVID's changed us forever, right? I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable for a second and say that I have performance anxiety. And so I get nervous and my voice shakes, and I find that when I acknowledge it, it's easier. I think a lot of what the work we're doing here is also doing our own work, because we can be better for other people if we're better for ourselves. So that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, what I've learned through my project. But I am going to be reading, because my childhood trauma was abusive parents who were all about results and grades and memorizing and those things. So that's where my trauma is. So I've decided to give myself grace and let myself read a few things. So I'm just letting you know that. And I think we can all practice that with ourselves, right? So like I said, we have sat, because of COVID, in loneliness and sadness and despair. And we've realized that we could survive it, right? It's been a really shitty time. If you have problems with cursing, I'm so sorry. I'm 100% Italian, it just kind of comes out. And people have lost jobs, they've lost homes, businesses, some have lost their lives because of this. We are in the middle of a very long overdue racial reckoning, very long overdue. There have been, so since I wrote my talk, it said 300 mass shootings in the US. Do you know what the number is now? I checked it right before I came in here, 464. Since I wrote this, hasn't even been a year, or 6 months, sorry. 27 of those were at schools. Everything is affecting us politically, socially, economically. Mental health is finally at the forefront, right? Why? It's impossible for us to ignore. Suicide hotline. I don't know if you know these numbers. Probably everyone in this room does. Since COVID, suicide hotline numbers, calls in, are up 300%. Which is good, because you know what? If you look at the numbers of suicides, it's actually gone down a little bit. People are finding the courage to call. And I think that deserves a hand, honestly. So I, like so many of you, had a few very major life events during these 3 years. And I keep saying, I'm not the same person I was before quarantine. Has anybody else said that? Like, I'm a totally different person, right? We are always evolving. And if you are the same person that you were 3 years ago, I think you should go back and look at some things, because a lot's happened, right? And it got me thinking. And listen, I'm an X-Gen, so I can tell you this. If it involved an edible, possibly. But I thought about this, and I thought, what if our life's purpose is not to find our biggest goal and figure out what we want to do and be the best and do the best? What if, just hear me out, if our life's purpose is to come back to ourselves, to that pure self, before the heartbreak, before that family member that you loved so much abandoned you, maybe before the addiction, before the heartbreak, before you got jaded. We all add things to our armor to survive the world. Maybe our life's purpose is to slowly take those things off, right? But I was not one of those people before this. Hustle, hustle, get to the top. Hustle culture. I could always be doing more. And then I read this book by Caroline Dooner called Tired as Fuck. We use busyness as a wonderful, horrible distraction from life and pain and emotions and things we don't want to face. It's a distraction from learning to be with ourselves. And it's sneaky because it's a very socially acceptable addiction. We wear it as a badge of honor. The slowdown taught us one very important thing: to slow down, right? Slowing down our process helps us see the layers of work we need to learn to unpack. Those habits, those things, those ideals that we absorbed to help us survive. So for those of you that work in suicide prevention or mental health advocacy in general, this is a really intense time for all of us, even more, right? Therapists are so hard to find. Everyone is booked at their capacity. Why? People are grieving. The human body was not designed to grieve this much, to hold this much at one time. Society is collectively grieving in different ways, and that is making public vulnerability way more common, public reactions and emotional reactions way more common, which makes all of your jobs very difficult. So I'm just putting that out here and telling you that I feel for you, and you all have been doing amazing jobs. It's hard. The process of people finally slowing down and sitting in their wounds long enough to feel things, to name things, and to begin the process is healing and amazing. But remember, it's happening collectively. And this is causing so many intense situations and conversations. And I firmly believe that that's a healthy thing. And again, my name is Em. I started a project called Faces of Fortitude in actually 2017. The number was actually wrong in my intro, and that was my fault. And I lost my brother, my only brother, to suicide. He was 26. He was a Yale graduate, prom king, so smart, so sensitive, and so troubled. And I spiraled after he died. And several years after he died, I was working with a bunch of photographers. I was not one at the time. And I took a self-portrait and I shared my story on Instagram, and it exploded. And that was 2017. And people started coming to me saying, "Can you take my picture and tell my story?" And I was like, "Oh, you wouldn't want that. I'm not a good photographer." And then I felt called to it, and I felt like, well, I will try. And I took a few, YouTube is a great school for things like this. And I took a few YouTube classes, and I taught myself to take photos, to edit photos, and to market myself online. And I learned something really fast. I thought this project was going to be so sad and so heavy, and at times it is. But the amount of light that I have found, not only am I sharing a space one-on-one with somebody for 2 hours, usually are the sessions, we share our stories of loss together, but we also share how we got up. And I realized so quickly that I was learning so much about healing because every single person heals very uniquely. And I had this kind of Rolodex of healing. I was like, oh, this person did this, and this person did this, and I realized this is something I should share, because we all collectively have different stories, just like when you're connecting with people here. There's power hidden in our discomfort, and I am very, very certain that if we use it correctly, it can be like a multivitamin. It's like, I'm gonna say, hard conversations are my new superfood, honestly. I'm actually looking for them now. My poor partner, they're like, we don't have to do this every time. And I'm like, actually, we should, though. Let's just get it out of the way. Let's just have this hard conversation. And they're like, too much fire in your chart. So I want to know what happens when you allow yourself to go to those dark and painful and stigmatized places. It hurts. I get it. It's painful. But did you know that when you try to recollect a memory like that, your mind and your body sometimes will put yourself in that place. So you'll think and you'll feel pain like it's actually happening. And if we can explain to ourselves and slow down and remember that that's not what's happening, and remember that our mind is scared, we can harness that fuel that's in that discomfort. So what would it look like if you showed up for yourself in those moments, like a best friend? Like if you closed your eyes, if you were feeling something in a moment, what would it look like if you showed up for yourself and stayed fully with yourself in that moment? Let's say you're talking to somebody here who's telling you their story and you recollect with something and you feel something. And instead of maybe creating an awkward situation or going to your room or whatever, taking one moment and just going, you know what? I'm so glad you told me that. But I'm feeling something and I'm not quite sure what it is. And I need to get to the bottom of it, but it's not you. And I appreciate this space, but I'm just gonna take a minute to go do that. How many of us have shared our suicide story and been like, oh, I'm a burden, that person just left, or that was awkward. So many people, unless you're in a space like this, don't know how to talk about it. So understanding that your pain sounds different outside of your head, and understanding that if we can take it out of our head and put it in this space for a minute and say, I'm feeling this, it can be that superfood that we need. So, a little therapy story before I start these steps with you. So I have been in therapy for like 9 years now, and my therapist, okay, first, before I tell you this funny story, I'm gonna go all over the place, but therapy is a privilege. I need to say that out loud. Therapy is a privilege. Not everyone can access it. It doesn't work for everyone. And also, it costs money, it's a privilege, and not everybody has access to it. So I think I'm talking about therapy, but I'm letting you know that. My therapist, Katie, decided it was apropos to not have one, but 2 babies during quarantine. So, like, I wouldn't need her or something. And then thanks to Murphy's rude laws, I had 2 major traumatic events during her maternity leaves. So I did what anybody would do. I got a plant. And then I got another one. And then I got another one. And another one. And then I have a small forest. We call it the Belltown Forest. And as the health of my plants ebbed and flowed, I noticed mine was ebbing and flowing with them. And I have this plant, her name is Abeo, and she's a maidenhair fern, and she is, I mean, you miss her watering by 20 minutes and she falls down the stairs with her head like this. But I don't give myself water when I feel like that. And I sat and I was like, what? Abeo was $11.99 at Home Depot. Like, what am I doing? And so I realized, I texted Katie. She was on her maternity leave, but I don't have good boundaries. So I was like, Katie, I was her first client ever when she was starting, so she kind of gives me that privilege. So anyways, I was like, Katie, I think I am onto something with my plants. And she was like, okay, whatever you need. And now she sees that I use these steps to unpack when I'm dealing with a childhood trauma or something that I'm unpacking, or a trauma from my brother's suicide or my own attempt, because I attempted at 17. And that's part of my story that if you go to the workshop later, we'll talk more about it. These steps really helped me. And when I tell you that I use these every week of my life, I mean that. When something comes up and I can't handle it, I use these steps. So I wanted to share them with you, and they're all plant-based, okay? I didn't mean it to sound like that, but that's funny. Okay. So your first step is sit and dig. In cancel culture, not cancel culture, way different. Counsel, sorry. Ooh, that's a whole other talk, isn't it? In council culture, we talk about sitting a lot, sitting in things, but I want to talk about digging. Because what happens when we dig? Anybody? It's messy. It's messy. And when we dig, especially around things that happened when we were younger, who hates it the most? Family. Family. So they don't want you to dig. But digging is where we get messy. Digging is where we find things. Digging is where we excavate. Brene Brown says shame derives its power from being unspeakable. We have to dig up those things in order to be able to give them voices. Step 2, unearth those roots. So I'm ex-gen, so I had boomer parents, and my parents used to pay us $1 for pulling weeds out of the garden. That's a whole other talk as well. But my abusive mother, would examine the roots and make sure they weren't broken. And if any of the roots were broken, we wouldn't get that dime, because that meant her weeds would come back. Because if you leave any root in there, she said, you have a chance of them coming back. Now, besides adding to my childhood trauma, it also taught me about my own emotional roots. How many of you think you get to the bottom of something, but in the back of your mind, you know there's still a fear there? I was terrified. I wrote was, and then I think it's funny that it's not past tense. Am terrified of death. When you have a traumatic death in your life, like a suicide, death is a scary thing. You want to protect everybody around you. So I had to name it to be able to move through it. It sounded like felt like tax in my mouth when I would first say it. But I had to get it. It was lodged in my body, and I had to get it out and talk about it. This is one of my favorite steps. How does it bloom? I use the word bloom. You all know it as trigger. I don't like the word trigger. I feel like trigger is negative, and trigger is telling us that it is something bad happening. It is good. It feels bad. But it is coming up because it needs to come up. If we can start looking at our triggers instead of with judgment, self-hate, because I think when something happens, when we're reactionary, we feel hard on ourselves or other people because we are shamed by other people. There are stigmas. There are all these things attached, right? When we have a bloom, if we can resort to being curious, what do you think? What type of person do you envision when I use the word curious? A child. You don't want to judge a child for doing something that they are just learning, correct? So we need to show ourselves kindness and grace, which means you can't judge yourself because you are connecting to older feelings, most likely. So ask yourself, what does shame and trauma look like in you when it shows up? What age do you feel? When was the first time you ever felt that specific feeling? Can you remember? Describe it even more. What does it look like in your body? Do you feel it viscerally here? Maybe your face gets flush. Maybe it's all cerebral. Maybe you shake. Name it. Say, when I feel this is what it looks like. Because the next time you feel it, you'll know that's where it's coming from and you found your root. The younger parts of ourselves need those voices because we didn't have the words and education that we have now, that we needed them to really describe what we were feeling. Prune and deadhead. Now listen, when we're in the midst of growth, we love that abundance, right? When I find a flailing plant at the grocery store and I bring it home and I save it, I think I can save any plant. I'm like, bring me your dead plants. I will save them. Or if you're looking through childhood trauma and you heal something, I feel like there was a point where I looked at Katie, my therapist, and I was like, go ahead and have another baby. Why don't you get a puppy? I thought I was good. I really did. I was like, let's go to once a month. She was like, okay. That lasted 1 month. Our plants continue to send nourishment to dead appendages. So if you have a leaf or a branch that's ill, the plant will continue to send it, even if it's dead. We need to remove things. Yes, Marie Kondo it, whatever you call it. We need to remove things that are no longer serving us because we need that energy for our growth. This means removing things that are often attached to our egos. That's the hard. It's really easy to remove things we don't want. Have you noticed that? It's so easy. Oh, I didn't like this person anyways. You're out of my life. What about the people you love, or the things you love, or the activities you love, or the behaviors, or the self-talk? Like, those are the things we really need to be able to look at. Step 5 is nutrients and patience. And I know this should be a given, but if a plant shrivels and dies, it's like when LaBeija has a dramatic moment and I water her, I can't sit there and watch her revive. It takes some time, right? On the same, if I take multivitamins for a week, I'm like, why is my stamina not better? We are in this immediate results society. Like, we want it now, overnight, expedited delivery, ASAP. Nobody wants to wait. We're doing all of this courageous, amazing work. What is it worth if you are not going to be patient with yourself? It's not worth anything. We have to be kind with our bounce back timeline. The thing that's been the best for me, and this is something that I will talk more about in the workshop if you come later, name a plant after yourself. Every time, you should have, the moments I've had with M, the plant, the Monstera. M got a new leaf, and I'm like, M, you worked so damn hard for that. And I go around my day going, I really did. M had this big Monstera leaf that was like, it was like a little damaged. And if my little horrible self-esteem 13-year-old didn't come out and like, you are beautiful anyways. And I had a cry session with this damn leaf because instead of saying things like, I didn't get anything done today at work, I was just all over the place. What about saying, you know what, I am glad that I went slow because when I'm all over the place, I make mistakes and I needed to be kinder to myself. Kinder self-talk is the first step to really, really learning to give ourselves nutrients and patience. Okay, this last one is one of the most important things in this 6-step process that I talk about here, especially at events like this. A very large reason I personally feel like we don't have safe spaces to talk about suicide is that we don't know the rhythm of these conversations. The average person that is not a trained, paid professional cannot handle more than 7 to 10 minutes of a severe trauma conversation. Period. It's just too much. Our bodies go into survival mode. Trauma is heavy to talk about. So in order to create safety, we have to make sure that we often think about the person telling the story feeling safe, but we need to remember that the person receiving has to feel safe. We have to learn to read a room and to give storytelling around these topics time to breathe, space for levity. I haven't really told jokes today, but I've brought humor. We have to remember to lift people around these hard topics because we don't know what they've been through. We don't know the blooms that are coming up in these conversations. Your listener needs to feel like they have space to breathe too. So what I'm learning is I have people come up to me all the time after talks and events or seeing my pictures and saying, this happened to me. And I get this, often 45-minute talk from someone about what's happened to them. And I wear crystals and I'm protected and all the woo-woos. But also, we need to have our own boundaries because you want to be the best. And so often people don't say words to each other to explain that. So they make people feel bad. Not intentionally, but because we can't read what's happening. So I'm just learning to say, hey, that's a big, big thing that happened to you. I'm so grateful that you trusted me with it. I'm feeling like it's a lot, and I would love to just stretch for a minute, have a glass of water. Do you want a glass of water with me? and then come back so I can really be present for this whole thing. And most of the time people are like, oh, of course. But it's when we go, okay, well, I gotta go. And that person is like, oh, that was too much. Oh, I'm horrible. My story is horrible. Nobody wants to hear it. And that's the last thing we want people to hear. But we need to voice it. I think it's important for us to understand that when we're getting to the bottom of these feelings, it can be curious. It can be something that we talk to someone about. It's not unsafe to talk to somebody about feelings you're having. I'm going to give you a funny thing because this is literally how I learned this step. My partner and I were talking about Sarah Jessica Parker. I was like, I'm not really a fan. I don't know why. I just am not. And I might have used the word hate because I have a fire sign. It's fine. And my partner was like, that's a very severe word to use for somebody you don't know why. And so with a little conversation, I was like, well, she's been married to Ferris Bueller for so long and I wanted to marry him when I was 15. And they looked at me and went, there it is. There it is. There's the root. And now I'm like, oh, she's not a bad person. Like, it was mine. It was mine. And so often when you're having a severe reaction to something, and remember, when I say severe, we might feel like it's valid, but when we're having a severe reaction to something, weigh it against the thing. You know, hate Sarah Jessica Parker, hate. No, it was severe. There was something underneath there, and it took some curiosity, some patience, and a little childlikeness to really be able to find it and spend time with it and be like, it's okay, Em. You know, Matthew Broderick's not gonna marry you, but you're valid. These were important. You don't have to hate her. It's okay. In closing, if anybody hasn't told you yet, this time has been one for the record books. It's been horrible. It is not, there's no manual. And if you've been in school, by the way, for any of this quarantine, you need a consensual hug, a really good cry session, because nobody's done it in the history. The last time there was a pandemic, they didn't have people just didn't go to school. So you're doing it all for the first time. You're blazing trails. You deserve. So if you think that you haven't handled something properly or you've been hard on yourself, I'm asking you to please give yourself some grace. It's never been more important for us to remember that we are fallible, to remember that we are going to make stumbles and mistakes, and we are more than that. We can make stumbles and mistakes, and we can still lean into joy. We still deserve joy. We still deserve to laugh with our full bellies. And we deserve happiness and good things. And that we can be alone and still survive, which is something that I could not say 5 years ago. And I live alone now and am surviving. And one more thing before I close with my favorite poem. If there's anybody here, I always get emotional when I do this, so I'm just gonna pull it together. If there's anybody here who is getting up every day and fighting and maybe not wanting to be here, but still here, we don't talk enough about celebrating you, because there are people that after their attempts or suicidal ideation are on the road, but there are people who are still thinking about it every day and continue to fight for their kids, for their families. And I'm gonna thank you for that, because you are showing us the strength that we need to keep going. So I'm just doing this for whoever's in this room that might feel that. Okay. So I want to thank Lines for Life team and everybody for having me, and for everybody that's shared. I was in my sweats after my 7-hour drive yesterday, kind of wandering and listening and watching, and it seems like a really amazing group of people. I'm excited to be here for the day and watch more things. I'm going to read you one of my favorite poems that was read to me by Oprah. Give it to me. Hold on. In 2014, I went to I'm not an Oprah fan. I'm not Oprah, but I'm Oprah. Does that make sense? Like, I didn't go. Her Live Your Best Life tour was coming. I didn't get tickets, but Oprah's going to be in town. But then a friend was like, hey, I got tickets to this and a friend couldn't go. Do you want to go with me? And I was like, of course, it's Oprah. So, and it was this amazing inspirational thing. I was probably from here to the door from Oprah. Like, I was close. She could see me. I was in the front row of the stadium. Anyways, at the end, she asked us to close our eyes and she read a poem. And first of all, it's Oprah reading to you. So I don't care. She could have read the box of Cheerios, and I would have cried. But I was sobbing when my eyes were closed. When I say I was sobbing, I have read this poem to myself once a week since 2014. It speaks to what I've just been talking about. And so if you feel safe enough to close your eyes right now, I ask you to do that. It's called Love After Love by Derek Walcott. And just think about what I just talked about and yourself and your own roots. And thanks again for being such a great audience. Love after love. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself, arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to yourself, to the stranger who has loved you your whole life, who you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit and feast on your life. Thanks again for having me, everybody.